When a crisis ends, another job begins. It's a job most of us, thankfully, never have to think about, and it's done by professionals who show up long after the first responders have gone. They are the unseen responders, the trauma scene cleanup technicians. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this essential industry and look at its journey from some pretty wild, unregulated beginnings to becoming a vital professional service.
And this line right here, it's taken directly from the industry's own rulebook, and it really gets to the heart of their mission. So we're not going to focus on the gruesome stuff. Instead, we're looking at the incredible effort to bring professionalism and ethics to a service that is just so sensitive, a service dedicated to protecting families when they are at their absolute most vulnerable.
So where did this whole profession even come from? Well, it wasn't always a formal thing. For the longest time, the awful burden of cleaning up after a tragedy fell on families or property owners, people who were just completely unprepared for the physical and emotional toll of that kind of work.
And things move fast, really fast. What started as a tiny niche service in the early 90s just exploded as people became more aware of the dangers of things like bloodborne pathogens. Suddenly, the demand for trained professionals went through the roof, leading the main certification body for the industry to start hammering out a formal standard by 2010. And just a decade later, those standards actually started becoming law. But before all these standards, the industry was, well, it was kind of like the Wild West. There were no specific rules, just generic workplace safety stuff. And that was a recipe for disaster. You had technicians facing serious health hazards without proper training, and even worse, it left grieving families totally vulnerable to unethical companies that could just swoop in and exploit them. There was just no consistent scientific way of getting the job done right.
So in response to all that chaos, the industry itself decided that it needed to get its house in order. The most experienced, most ethical folks in the business got together to create a comprehensive set of rules, a true standard of care that everyone could be measured against.
And here's the key thing. This S540 standard wasn't some rulebook forced on them by the government. Nope, it was built from the ground up by industrial hygienists, trainers, and technicians who had been in the trenches for years. They basically took decades of practical, real-world experience and combined it with hard science to define what a professional, safe, and effective cleanup actually looks like.
So what's actually in this standard? Well, it really all boils down to 4 key pillars. First and foremost, safety. Job number 1 is protecting everyone involved. Second, document everything. You need a clear, professional paper trail from start to finish. Third, and this is a big one, the job is about physical removal of contaminants, not just covering things up. And finally, you have to prove the job's done right by verifying that the area is truly scientifically clean.
And following these pillars, well, it takes a lot more than just good cleaning. It's an applied science. It demands really specific knowledge of things like microbiology and sticking to super rigorous safety protocols.
See, technicians aren't just dealing with blood. They're trained to handle what OSHA calls opium, or other potentially infectious material. And this definition alone shows you the huge scope of biohazards they have to be prepared for, everything from cerebrospinal fluid to any fluid that might be contaminated. Now, to handle all these materials safely, professionals live by a critical mindset called universal precautions. The guiding principle is pretty simple. Eliminate all guesswork. You treat all human blood and body fluids as if you know for a fact they are infectious. This isn't about being scared. It's about a strict, scientific commitment to keeping everyone safe.
And that precision carries over to the tools they use. For instance, you might think sanitizer and disinfectant are basically the same thing, right? Well, they're not. Not even close. A sanitizer just reduces germs down to a level that's considered safe. That is absolutely not enough for a trauma scene. You need a disinfectant, which is required because it actively kills and destroys disease-causing microorganisms. Using the right chemical on the right surface is a non-negotiable part of the science. Okay, so this S440 standard was a massive leap forward. It gave all the ethical companies a benchmark, a way to prove they were doing things the right way. But there was a catch. It was voluntary. So what happens when a company just decides to ignore the standard and keep doing things the wrong way, the dangerous way?
Well, that's exactly where the state of Georgia decided to step in. They saw the very real harm that these unregulated companies were causing, and they decided to take the industry's own voluntary rules and turn them into legally enforceable law. They became the very first state in the country to do it. And the motivation behind the law was crystal clear. As one industry advocate put it, the law was designed to stop victims from being re-victimized. A family that has just been through an unimaginable tragedy should never, ever have to deal with predatory businesses or unsafe work on top of all their grief.
And the case for this law was built on documented, just horrific abuses. I mean, can you imagine companies telling grieving families that everything was contaminated, only to turn around and sell their loved ones' belongings at a yard sale? Or workers being so careless that family members later discovered missing remains? The most shocking stuff involved the illegal dumping of human remains in public dumpsters. These weren't just bad business practices. They were a profound violation of trust and public safety.
So to stop all this, Georgia's law created some clear, mandatory hurdles. Now, companies have to formally register with the state. The owners have to pass background checks and get fingerprinted. They have to prove they have the right insurance and bonding to protect the homeowner. And crucially, they must have a formal contract with a licensed medical waste facility. That ensures that all biohazards are disposed of safely and with respect. So when you put it all together, a professional standard like the S540 and a protective law like Georgia's, what you get is a shield. And it's not just for one group. It raises the bar for safety and accountability for absolutely everyone involved.
So let's break it down. Who's really protected by all this? Well, first and foremost, victims' families. They're shielded from being taken advantage of. Then there are the technicians themselves. They get legal protection so an employer can't just force them into a dangerous scene without proper training. The public is kept safe from things like illegally dumped biohazardous waste. And finally, the industry itself is protected. Regulation helps preserve the reputation of all the good, ethical companies by weeding out the bad actors.
Ultimately, if there's one thing to take away from this whole story, it's this. Standards and laws aren't just about red tape. They are the framework for a system of accountability. They make sure that this incredibly critical work done in the wake of tragedy is always performed with the highest levels of safety, respect, and professionalism.
And that kind of leaves us with a bigger question, doesn't it? This was one industry that saw a serious problem and rose to the challenge to fix it. But as our world gets more and more complex, and we rely on more specialized services for everything, how do we make sure that every critical industry develops its own strong standard of care to protect the very people it's supposed to serve?